Hey y'all, I'm Shannon Ballard, host and creator of Southern Mysteries. This show is independent, which means it's just me, a microphone, and a very deep love for sharing the forgotten stories and mysteries of the South, which I could not do without the incredible folks who support the show on Patreon. Their support makes all the difference, and I'm so very grateful. Want to say a big welcome and heartfelt thanks to new patrons, Carlton Mullis in Atlanta, Ronaldo De Leon of Rolling Meadows, Illinois, Tara Brown of Logan, West Virginia, Sunita Jarvis of Greenville, Florida, and to those of you who joined from mysterious locations, Sandy, Kathy, Elizabeth Hodge, and Tasha. Thank you. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps grow this community of curious minds. If you'd like to join them, you can head to patreon.com/Southern Mysteries, where you can unlock the first 3 seasons of the podcast, exclusive bonus episodes, and the monthly Audacious series, where I dig into some of the most scandalous crimes and controversies in American history. You can sign up now at patreon.com/Southern Mysteries, or just search Southern Mysteries Podcast on the Patreon app. Thanks for being here. Now, on to the story. In November 1948, a murder in Toombs County, Georgia, led to one of the most disturbing miscarriages of justice in the Jim Crow South. Amy Mallard, a black woman, was accused of murdering her husband, Robert, despite the fact he was shot and killed by a white mob in front of her. What followed was a sham investigation and a courtroom spectacle that revealed just how far the system would go to protect the killers and punish a woman for speaking the truth. Welcome to Southern Mysteries, exploring Southern history and true crime. I'm your host, Shannon Ballard. This is episode 167, A Widow's Stand in Georgia, the story of Amy and Robert Mallard. Robert Mallard achieved a level of prosperity that was uncommon for black men living in rural Georgia in the 1940s. His success existed in a time and place shaped by laws and customs designed to keep black people in a position of constant disadvantage. In the 1940s, states across the South, including Georgia, were still governed by Jim Crow laws. These were state and local rules that enforced racial segregation in every part of public life: schools, housing, public services, transportation, even cemeteries. But Jim Crow wasn't just about laws. It was a culture of fear and violence. It was designed to keep black citizens politically powerless and socially controlled. Law enforcement, the courts, and the press often upheld that system. And when black Southerners pushed back, when they voted, demanded respect, or simply succeeded in spite of it, they were often met with intimidation, arrest, or worse. Robert Mallard stood out in that world. He owned land, had a respected job, and he expected to be treated with dignity. For some in Toombs County, that was reason enough to see him as a threat. The 37-year-old World War II veteran lived on a farm near Lyons with his wife Amy and their 2-year-old son John. Amy was an elementary school teacher, and Robert was a successful traveling casket salesman who drove a new 1948 Frazier sedan. Robert Mallard's success drew attention from local white residents who referred to him as an uppity black man. To white supremacists, especially members of the KKK, his success was seen as a direct threat because he dared to live beyond the limits they imposed. By the 1940s, tensions in Georgia were already high. Black citizens were beginning to assert their rights after World War II, including the right to vote, and white supremacists pushed back violently. In early 1948, a black man in a neighboring county was shot and killed for voting in a primary. Members of the KKK warned Robert and Amy Mallard not to vote in Georgia's November 1948 special gubernatorial election, which featured Herman Talmadge, an avowed segregationist, on the ballot. Robert Mallard held his head high, and he knew his rights. He refused to be intimidated, and he voted, a decision that may have sealed his fate in the minds of white supremacists. There was also an instance when Amy Mallard honked her car horn to get the attention of a white churchgoer, asking them to move a vehicle that was blocking the road. Today, the act seems normal and innocent, but in the Toombs County of 1948, it was seen by many residents as a show of insolence from a Black woman. By the fall of that year, the racial tension in the county had boiled over. On the night of November 20th, 1948, Robert and Amy Mallard's worst fears became reality. The Mallards had attended a school fundraising event with their 2-year-old son and 2 of Amy's teenage cousins. As they drove home that night, they were ambushed on a county road just outside Lyons. A group of about 20 white men in Ku Klux Klan robes had blocked the road with their cars. As Robert stopped in front of a church, Amy spotted a familiar car and recognized at least one of the armed men standing in the road. Seconds later, the mob opened fire on the Mallard sedan, shattering the windshield with pistol shots and hitting Robert Mallard in the chest. As Amy and the children screamed in terror, the attackers fled, leaving 37-year-old Robert dead at the scene. Once the mob fled, Amy got out of the car and ran to the home of a nearby farmer, Frank Brinson. Brinson contacted authorities and reported the attack, and Toombs County Sheriff R.E. Gray responded. To the shock of both Brinson and Amy, Sheriff Gray refused to organize a manhunt or search for the killers. Instead, the sheriff treated Amy as the prime suspect. He searched her and her belongings on the spot, emptying her purse while her husband's body lay nearby. Amy Mallard realized this could be the beginning of a cover-up. Fearing for her safety and her son's, Amy fled to Savannah, Georgia, where she stayed with family and friends while planning her husband's funeral. In the days after Robert Mallard was murdered, law enforcement in Toombs County didn't act like they were trying to solve a crime. The sheriff's office went quiet. For 4 days, they didn't speak to the press, and there was no sign of an investigation. When Sheriff Gray finally made a public statement, he acknowledged that some witnesses said the attackers wore white robes, but the very next day, he changed his story. He claimed the earlier reports were in error and went a step further, slandering Robert Mallard as a, quote, bad Negro, hated by all who knew him. In other words, Sheriff Gray implied Robert Mallard got what he deserved. White leaders in the area closed ranks. The Grand Dragon of the Georgia Klan, Dr. Samuel Green, launched his own so-called investigation and quickly produced statements from Sheriff Gray and others, clearing the Klan of any involvement. Local media followed suit. One small-town editor was so dismissive of Robert Mallard's murder, he said, quote, "It's just another Negro killing. I'm not going to put it in my paper." But the story did not stay buried. A tip reached a Macon newspaper, and that's when Ralph McGill, the influential editor of the Atlanta Constitution, got involved. McGill was a white journalist who often challenged the South's racial status quo. He started asking questions and publishing what he found. At one point, McGill reported that a self-described white supremacist had offered a $500 reward for information saying no decent white man will support murder and lynch violence. It was an unusual break in the white silence and enough to pressure Georgia's governor into taking action. Governor Herman Talmadge, an avowed segregationist, hadn't wanted to get involved, but with growing scrutiny from the press and the NAACP, he directed the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to take over the case. What happened next only deepened the injustice. On November 27th, 1 week after the killing, the Mallard family held Robert's funeral in Savannah. As the service ended, GBI agents arrested Amy Mallard in front of her family and friends. Instead of going after the mob that killed her husband, the state charged Amy with his murder, accusing her of making up the entire story of the Klan ambush. The lead agent told reporters, "It is our belief that the Klan are not guilty of shooting Mallard," but offered no evidence to support Amy's arrest. She was taken back to Lyons and held for 9 hours of interrogation. Her 2 teenage cousins, who had been in the car the night of the murder, were also arrested. So was the neighbor who helped Amy, Frank Brinson. It was a clear attempt to intimidate anyone who might testify about what really happened that night. Amy Mallard was eventually released without bond. She had been formally accused, but never indicted. There was no case against her. But the damage was done. Fearing for her life, Amy didn't even go home the night she was released. She hid in the woods until it was safe to leave town. What happened that day, arresting a widow at her husband's funeral, sent a chilling message. Instead of bringing the killers to justice, Georgia officials turned their attention to discrediting the only witness brave enough to tell the truth. They never explained why Amy Mallard had been arrested, and it became clear, without outside pressure, the case would be buried. The National NAACP, led by Walter White and legal counsel Thurgood Marshall, took immediate interest in what happened in Toombs County. They pushed for federal authorities to step in, but that was easier said than done. In the 1940s, lynching wasn't a federal crime. Unless the violence directly violated a civil right, like voting, or could be tied to state actors, the federal government had no legal ground to intervene. The NAACP used the press to keep attention on the case and began mapping out a legal strategy. In Georgia, they brought in attorney A.T. Walden to represent Amy Mallard. Walden was a respected Black lawyer, but he moved cautiously. He didn't launch a full investigation, and it was clear that if progress was going to be made, it wouldn't come from inside Toombs County. Help came from an unexpected place. Joseph Goldwasser, a Jewish businessman from Cleveland, Ohio, and a supporter of the NAACP, took matters into his own hands. He traveled to Georgia, posing as a traveling salesman, and within days, managed to do what authorities had not. On November 30th, Goldwasser met face-to-face with 2 white men rumored to be part of the mob, William Howe and Roderick Clifton. Both men admitted they'd been involved. Goldwasser took that information straight to Governor Talmadge and made it clear if the state didn't act, he would take his findings to the FBI. That outside pressure worked. Governor Talmadge made a public statement offering Amy Mallard protection if she returned to swear out warrants. And for the first time since Robert Mallard's murder, the governor signaled the state might pursue charges. On December 4th, 5 white men from Toombs County, Roderick Clifton, William Howe, James Spivey, Herschel Sykes, and Barney Sykes, turned themselves in. Their surrender was arranged in advance to avoid the embarrassment of being hauled in by law enforcement. The hope for justice was short-lived. Soon after the men surrendered, fires broke out across the Black business district in Lyons. The arson coincided with the timing of the surrender and was meant to send a message that pushing for justice came with a cost. Even with the threat of violence hanging in the air, Amy Mallard stood her ground. On December 8th, she returned to Lyons under promised state protection. That day, she swore out a murder warrant against William Howe, the man she had seen among the mob that killed her husband. 2 days later, a special grand jury was called at Toombs County Courthouse. Amy took the stand and, under oath, recounted what happened the night Robert was killed. She described the ambush, the white-robed mob, and named Hal as the man she recognized. She also identified Roderick Clifton's car, parked near the scene. Ralph McGill, the journalist from the Atlanta Constitution who had helped bring the case to public attention, also testified. He spoke about the reluctance of local officials to pursue justice in the case. When the grand jury returned, they handed down indictments for William Howell and Roderick Clifton in the murder of Robert Mallard. The other 3 men who had surrendered weren't charged due to a lack of direct evidence. The indictments marked a turning point. In 1940s Georgia, it was rare for any white man to be held legally accountable for the murder of a black person. For the first time since the night of the murder, Amy Mallard felt a sliver of hope that someone might be held responsible. In January 1949, the Mallard case went to trial. The courtroom in Lyons was packed. Roughly 300 white spectators filled every seat and lined the walls in the Toombs County Courthouse. The all-white, all-male jury was selected in about 20 minutes. The trial officially opened on January 11th. On paper, it was the state of Georgia versus William L. Spud Howell, since Howell was the first to be tried. And at the center of it all was Amy Mallard, the widow and eyewitness who would be the state's key witness. From the start, it was clear this would not be a fair fight. The prosecutor, Solicitor William Lanier, offered very little evidence beyond Amy's testimony. When she took the stand, she described the night her husband was murdered, how she, Robert, their son, and 2 teenage relatives were driving home when they turned onto that side road near their farm. That's where they were met by the mob of white-robed men, all carrying pistols. She told the court how the mob surrounded the car and opened fire, and how she watched her husband die in the front seat. When asked if she recognized anyone, Amy said yes and identified William Howell as one of the gunmen. Reliving that night in front of a packed courtroom was too much. As Amy described the moment Robert was shot, she broke down and collapsed to the floor in tears. Her grief was raw, but was met by laughter from spectators in the room. One of Amy's supporters helped her to her feet. She took a moment, composed herself, and finished her testimony. And the defense got to work. Howell's lead attorney, Thomas Sharp, called several witnesses to support Howell's alibi, friends who claimed he had been somewhere else that night. Then Sharp floated an unsubstantiated theory that Amy might have been armed. There was no evidence to support the theory, but the defense didn't need evidence. They just needed to plant doubt. The defense implied this wasn't a lynching because it was possible Amy fired the first shot. Then came the most outrageous turn in this trial. Sharp called 2 of the sitting jurors to leave the jury box and testify against Amy Mallard. In 1948, Georgia law allowed this. The jurors, both local men, told the court they believed Amy's reputation was so bad that they wouldn't believe anything she said under oath. Even more unbelievable, the prosecutor didn't object, and the jury heard from 2 of their own that the woman on the stand couldn't be trusted. At that point, the outcome was all but decided. It took the jury 25 minutes to deliver a verdict. On January 12th, William Howell was found not guilty of murder. The courtroom erupted in cheers, and spectators congratulated Howell as he walked out a free man. With Howell acquitted, the prosecutor quickly dropped the charges against Roderick Clifton, saying there wasn't enough evidence to move forward. The judge agreed and dismissed the case. Amy Mallard had been forced to relive the worst night of her life, while the men who murdered her husband walked free. Although supporters of the Klan in Toombs County considered the verdict justified, much of the country saw it for what it was, an outrage. National media outlets covered the story, and the public reaction among civil rights groups, the Black press, and Americans who were stunned to learn lynchings were still happening in the Deep South was one of anger and mobilization. Many saw Amy Mallard as a symbol of perseverance and courage. She had narrowly escaped being lynched herself, yet found the strength to tell her story and stand up to a system that had tried to silence her. There was an outpouring of sympathy and support, and Amy refused to disappear quietly. In early 1949, she and her family began a national speaking tour organized by the NAACP. With Joseph Goldwasser by her side, she traveled to cities across the country, sharing what happened in Georgia and calling on Americans to demand justice. The tour was organized to raise awareness of the need for federal anti-lynching legislation and help shine a national spotlight on the violence of Jim Crow. In city after city, Amy spoke to large, integrated audiences, and in every one of those rooms, she made the same vow. She would spend the rest of her life fighting for democracy, not just for herself, but for all Americans. But back in Georgia, the Klan wasn't done. On July 4th of 1949, just 6 months after the trial, the Mallards' vacant home in Lyons was burned to the ground. This act of arson, on Independence Day, made it clear that the Klan still held power and that the Mallards were being punished for speaking out. It also served as a warning to other Black families who might dare to seek justice. Amy Mallard got the message that it wasn't safe to go back to Georgia. She left for good, moving north with her children and settling in New York, where Robert had family. There she found a degree of safety that had never been possible in the South. The legal system had failed the Mallards. No one was ever held accountable for Robert's murder, but the case left a lasting mark. It galvanized civil rights organizations, and alongside other lynchings in Georgia during the late 1940s, helped build momentum for federal action. Activists pushed harder for anti-lynching legislation and for greater oversight of Southern courts that had long protected white supremacy. Though Amy Mallard's name faded from the headlines, her story remains part of the long fight for justice and equality in America. The Mallard story will forever stand as a symbol of tragedy, resilience, and resistance, and remains a sobering reminder of the American South that was, and a testament to those who dared to challenge it. Southern Mysteries is created and hosted by me, Shannon Ballard. As always, you can find sources for this episode here in the show notes where you're listening or at southernmysteries.com. If you're enjoying Southern Mysteries, you can help others discover this independent podcast by rating and reviewing the show on the platform you use to listen. Also, be sure to hit the follow button so you never miss a new episode. If you want to dive deeper into Southern Mysteries, you can access the show archive of the first 3 seasons and special Southern Mysteries shorts by joining me on Patreon. Your support helps cover the cost of research and hosting the show, which I manage on my own without any support staff. In return, you'll gain access to exclusive content not available anywhere else. And if you'd like to support at the Much Obliged tier, you can join my monthly Audacious podcast, which features stories about some of the most shocking and scandalous crimes in American history. If you have the Patreon app, open it up and search for Southern Mysteries to learn more and support my work, or you can go directly to patreon.com/Southern Mysteries. Thanks so much for listening.